Hello and welcome back to Fundamentals in Ecology. My name is Umesh Srinivasan and I am at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science. And today we will be talking about competition. Competition has been the dominant interaction in community ecology. It has been the dominant paradigm in trying to explain how communities are structured the way that they are. So people have spent a lot of time trying to understand both the interaction of competition itself between two species, but also how that interaction then leads to changes in the abundances of species, leading ultimately to change in community structure and community function. You are familiar with the Lotka-Volterra two-species competition models, where if you have a set of two species, then one species, the addition of an individual of one species decreases the population growth rate of the other species by some amount, and then that leads to potential interactions between species, leading to either stable coexistence or unstable coexistence or competitive exclusion between two species. So that is those models are based on how the addition of individuals of species A suppresses or decreases both population growth rates or lambda and K or carrying capacity of another species, and the other way around. And these interactions of competition need not be symmetrical. The impact that species A might have on B might be much higher than the negative impact that species B has on A. In that case, the competition is asymmetrical, with one species, species A, being a superior competitor than the other species, species B. A lot of thought has also gone into asking, if there are two species that actually coexist and they're also feeding on the same or similar resources, how are they able to coexist? How have they managed to avoid competition? And can we say that an ancestor of this species was actually competing with another species, but then what happened was in these two populations, some traits changed between those two species, so they started specializing slightly on a slightly different resource and are not competing as strongly anymore. And that, looking at species traits and inferring whether there was competition in the past, that led to the divergence of traits in these species, that's called the ghost of competition past. And like we all know, competition is lateral, it is within a trophic level, it's between individuals of species that are at a particular trophic level, unlike top down and bottom up effects which are across trophic levels. The way in which we can classify competition can be in many ways. You can have species level classification, which is intraspecific competition versus interspecific competition. Right? If two individuals of the same species are competing with each other, that's intraspecific competition. If two individuals of different species are competing with each other, that is interspecific competition. Typically, we expect that the strength of intraspecific competition would be higher than the strength of interspecific competition, because individuals within a particular species are more likely to be more similar in the resources that they use than two individuals that belong to two different species, which are likely to be more different than each other than two individuals belonging to the same species. That's one way to classify competition. And if you go back and you think about the Lotka-Volterra two species competition models, there is a coefficient called alpha which regulates the strength of interspecific competition, and alpha usually is less than 1, which means that interspecific competition is not as strong as intraspecific competition. The other way to classify competition is through mechanistic through the mechanism through which competition operates. So, for example, you can have interference competition, which is a direct interaction between two species, right? It's a direct, you can see what these hyenas and these lions are actually directly interacting for a prey, which is a wildebeest. So there is aggression, it's direct. Some species might steal food from other species, and that's something called kleptoparasitism. All of this would come under interference competition, which is direct interaction, violent, aggressive, potentially aggressive interaction. The other type of competition, other two types of competition are types of competition which are indirect, where two competing species might not be even aware of each other, just the way in which definitely those hyenas are aware of the fact that there is a lion, aware of the fact that there is the wildebeest prey between them. But you could have two species and individuals of those species where they never come into contact, but they do compete. And those examples of those types of competition are exploitation competition, which is also called scramble competition, which is indirect, and it's the exploitation of a common resource. So for example, there might be a fig tree, and during the day birds are feeding on the figs, and in the night bats come and feed on the figs. The birds don't interact with the bats directly, but because they're feeding on the same resource, the birds are decreasing the amount of resource available to bats, bats are decreasing the amount of resource available to birds, and therefore they come into competition for that common resource. The third is a very interesting kind of competition. It's called apparent competition, again indirect, but it's mediated through a common enemy, which could be a predator or a pathogen, and we'll see a very interesting example of apparent competition as well. So let's look at exploitation competition. What you've got here are two species of tits, the blue tit and on the right, and the great tit on the left, and this species of bird called the collared flycatcher here. Now the collared flycatcher and these two species of tits both compete for a particular resource, for two resources. They're both competing for insects, and they're also competing for nesting sites. So they're competing for these nest boxes that researchers have placed in these woodlands in Europe. Now what's happening here is that the collared flycatcher nests in any kind of nest box, whereas the tits prefer deep nest boxes. They prefer nest boxes that where the floor is much deeper. So it is possible to exclude or prevent these tits from nesting in these nest boxes simply by raising the floor of those nest boxes. And when that floor is raised, the tits are not going to nest in them, but the collared flycatcher will continue to nest in those shallower nest boxes. So what you're seeing is data from a paper by Gustafsson, data from 2 years, 1982 and 1983. The qualitative patterns are the same. So what you've got is experimental conditions where the floor of the nest box has been raised and the tits have been excluded from those nest boxes, and control conditions in C where the nest box has not been altered and it's open and available for tits to use, and that's there for two kinds of forests that have low densities of tits and flycatchers and high densities of tits and flycatchers. So what you see here on the y-axis is individual fitness of collared flycatchers, and consistently across all comparisons, individual fitness or the number of offspring raised and number of adults that survive, adult pairs that survive, is always higher in the experimental condition where tits have been excluded. So when you remove tits, you remove the competitor, then the fitness of the collared flycatcher consistently increases, showing that even though there might not be any direct interaction between these two tit species and the flycatcher, the very presence of those tit species is actually causing a reduction in collared flycatcher fitness. So this is an example of exploitation competition. Here is an example of apparent competition between leaf miner species and their parasitoids. So leaf miners are multiple species of insects that lay their eggs within the lamina of the leaf, and then the larvae hatch and they crawl through the leaf feeding on the leaf matter. So when if you've ever seen leaves with squiggly white lines on them, that's because of leaf miners, and leaf miners belong to a diverse variety of insects, beetles, flies and so on. So leaf miners lay their eggs in leaves, and there is a set of species called parasitoid wasps that lay their eggs in leaf miner larvae, and those eggs hatch, and then the wasp larvae eats away the leaf miner. So these are called parasitoids, not exactly parasites, not exactly predators either, but a mix of the two, parasitoids. So what you're seeing on the top over there, each bar, this is called a bipartite network. It has two parts, and those two parts are connected to each other in some way. What you're seeing on the top is the parasitoid community. So each bar represents a particular parasitoid wasp species. What you're seeing at the bottom here is leaf miner species. So each bar represents a particular leaf miner, and the size of the bars is in relation to the abundance of these parasitoids and these leaf miners. So let's look at two leaf miners. These are both beetles, Pachyschelus scholaris, which is here, and Pentispa fairmyri, which is there. Both of them share a common enemy or common species that causes negative impacts on them. So this parasitoid preys both on Pachyschelus scholaris and Pentispa fairmyri. There is another set of parasitoids which are in the red on top that lay their eggs in a variety of leaf miner species. They particularly affect Calcomyza flies of the genus Calcomyza. Now, what would happen if you removed this species? If you removed this species entirely, the question is, if you excluded that species, what would happen to the population of a species that it shares a parasitoid with? And people went and did exactly that. They removed Pentispa fairmyri from the system and Calcomyza flies from this system, and asked, if I remove Pentispa fairmyri, what happens to Pachyschelus scholaris? And if I remove Calcomyza flies, what happens to all the other species that the Calcomyza flies share parasitoids with, right, including these and these. So this is an experimental removal of one of two potentially competing species. What happened was, on the left is the odds ratio of being parasitized. Yeah. So if the probability of being parasitized is 1, let's say, the probability, some relative probability of being parasitized in the system where the species have not been taken out, then relative to that, what is the probability of being parasitized by a parasitoid for these fly leaf miners and Pachyschelus scholaris, which has been left over, the beetle that is still in that plant host parasitoid web. In fact, relative to levels of parasitism when the competitor species was present, actually probability of being parasitized has dropped. So instead of being relatively 100, it's now become relatively 60% for the leaf miners and relatively 10% for Pachyschelus scholaris. And the density of these leaf miners and of this beetle has also increased. So they're being parasitized less, therefore more individuals are surviving to adulthood, and therefore the population sizes have gone up. And so this interaction is because a high number of species A leads to an increase in the number of the parasitoid fly or parasitoid wasp, which then leads to increased parasitization of another species, causing its population to decline. So the increase in population size of species A is not leading to the decrease in population size of species B through competition for the same resources. They are feeding on different things. Their host plants are different. So they are not competing with each other for things like food. However, because they have a common parasitoid, an increase in species A numbers will cause a decline in species B numbers through the increase of the parasitoid population size. Similarly, when you decrease the population size of species A, or you remove species A completely from the system, then that leads to an increase in the population size of species B, because the decrease in the population size of species A has led to a decrease in that parasitoid that both species A and species B share. So, this is called apparent competition. And there is also apparent facilitation, where two species that share another common interactor, that link between those three species then leads to one species facilitating each other indirectly through another species. But we will talk about that when we get to facilitation and mutualisms. Let us look at competition and community structure in terms of intra-specific competition. We have been talking about interspecific competition so far, exploitation, apparent and direct interference competition. This again is from Barrow, Colorado island. You can see that island over there on the top left. And the pattern that you see in the tree community of this island is that 9 species make up 50% of the total individuals. So, 9 species are very, very common. So, if there were 100 individual trees, 50 of those trees would be represented by only 9 species. The rarest half of the number of species in this system, 153 species, make up only 0.6% of the total number of individuals. So, a lot of species are very, very rare. And obviously, the question is, why do you see a pattern like this? Why do you see that there are some species that are very, very common and other species that are very, very rare? So, some people went out and asked that question and asked whether it was intraspecific competition or negative density dependence that is driving this pattern. So, what they did was to take seedlings of different tree species and plant those seedlings next to a seedling of the same species, or a conspecific seedling which is A, or plant them next to an adult of the same species which is B, or plant them next to a seedling of a different tree species which is a heterospecific seedling C, or plant them next to an adult of a different species, or a heterospecific adult which is D. And then they asked what was the effect of being a neighbor of either this, a sapling or adult of the same species, or a sapling of an adult or a different species. And that the effect on survival, if it is negative in this direction, that centered around 0, meaning that there is no effect on survival. This is a positive effect on survival, and all of these are negative effects on survival. And so, what you have got is, if you take a seedling and you plant it next to a seedling of the same species, then mostly you have negative effects on survival, likely because of competition for resources. Similarly, if you plant a seedling next to an adult of the same species, again what you have is mostly negative outcomes. You have impacts that are detrimental to survival. For heterospecific seedlings, there wasn't much of an effect. That effect is centered around 0, and for heterospecific adults, again that effect is centered around 0. So, there are some species for which planting a seedling next to an individual of the same species does not really matter there, right. So, there are about 10 species here, where if you plant a seedling of that species next to seedling of its own species, it doesn't, the effect is not that strong, the competitive effect is not that strong, survival rates don't change that much, or there is very little negative density dependence. But if you plant but for say 30 species, the competitive effect is very high, it is very negative, it's you are going to a situation where having a neighbor of the same species has a very strong negative effect on the survival of that species. And what these scientists did was to measure the abundance or the density of the species, of these various species on the x-axis, and to measure conspecific neighboring effect, which is this and this, plot that on the y-axis, and it turns out that species where the conspecific negative effect is close to 0, that is conspecific negative density dependence or competition, the strength of competition is low. In these species have high area, have high population sizes. Species for which intraspecific competition effects are high and negative, though for those species population sizes are low. Population sizes are low, population sizes are high. And so it could be, it seems that we have a pattern here that is consistent with the strength of intraspecific competition determining abundances and therefore determining community structure. So it's within species competition. If competition is high, then that leads to rarity potentially. This pattern indicates that that might be a possibility. If intraspecific competition is low, then actually you can have multiple individuals of the same species occupying the same habitat, right? And so therefore that leads to species being more common than species for which intraspecific competition is an issue. Robert MacArthur saw that multiple species of very similarly sized, very similar diet birds called warblers that would come to North America every year to breed in these. They migrate from North America to South America, they breed in North America, and they spend their winters in Central and South America. And so they would come every summer to North America, to these coniferous forests in North America, and feed on invertebrates in these coniferous forests. And Robert MacArthur wondered, how is it possible that there are so many similar species that you can pack into this one habitat and they are not driving each other to extinction? You know, they're able to coexist basically in this area. And so he actually sat and spent a lot of time looking at how these warblers are foraging, looking at how these warblers are actually feeding, what is the pattern of the way in which these warblers feed. And so he finds, for example, that the Cape May warbler feeds only on new needles and at the top of the tree. The yellow-rumped warbler feeds at the bottom part of the tree. The bay-breasted feeds on the inner parts of the tree. Black-throated green feeds on the outer parts of the tree. So even if you have, and the Blackburnian breeds there in the intermediate parts outside. So even though you have multiple warbler species all potentially feeding on the same resource, the conclusion that MacArthur arrived at was they're avoiding competition by changing the way in which they feed, changing something important in the way in which they feed. In this case, what has happened was probably that there was a certain warbler species in the past that could have potentially competed with all of these species, and these could have potentially competed with each other, but over time they have diverged. Their niches have shifted a little bit. The Cape May warbler's niche on some sense on one axis is just the tops of those pine trees. The yellow rump warbler's foraging niche is the bottom part of these pine trees. And so when those niches get differentiated, when species start differing from each other in the way in which they might access resources, competition might come down. And you could look at current patterns of how species are using their habitats or how species traits are distributed to ask whether there was competition in the past. So this sort of pattern is the ghost of competition past. This sort of pattern that we are seeing here in terms of foraging is a result potentially of there having been competition in the past and species having over evolutionary time evolved to minimize competition or to decrease competition. So this brings us to competitive exclusion or the principle of competitive exclusion, which is also called Gauss's law, and Gauss put forward this principle in 1934, which said that complete competitors cannot coexist. which is that if you have two species or two non-interbreeding populations that occupy exactly the same niche and are sympatric and are found together, then one species will displace the other to extinction. One species will be a superior competitor, the other species will be an inferior competitor, and the superior competitor will cause the other species to go extinct. It will competitively exclude the other species because it is a superior competitor. Garrett Hardin in 1960 reviewed this principle of competitive exclusion and gave his opinion on it, which he said was it's an unclear and ambiguous law. Every one of those four words is ambiguous. Every one of those four words, there's a lot of uncertainty attached with it. What is complete? What is a complete competitor? Cannot coexist where? In the same location at the same time. It's just said that this law is very unclear. Actually, Park and Lloyd tried to test this law of competitive exclusion using these two flower beetles. These are the same beetles that you find in wheat flour. If you've kept this wheat flour containers in your kitchen, you will find these little tribolium beetles. And it's two beetles, two Tribolium confusum and Tribolium castaneum. They look very similar to each other. They feed on the same resource. And so if you took different densities of or different population sizes of these two Tribolium beetles and you put them together in the same location, the same box that has wheat flour in it, do you consistently see that one species always ends up displacing the other? And after some time, after some reasonable time, do you always see Tribolium castaneum, the red flower beetle, being the only species present in that experiment because it is a superior competitor and it should exclude Tribolium confusum? The results are not clear. The results are mixed. Sometimes both of those species coexist. Sometimes the red flower beetle is present but the confused flower beetle is not. Sometimes the confused flower beetle is present but the red flower beetle is not. So could be dependent on various things. It could be dependent on if you have two species that are potentially competing with each other and one species actually is a superior competitor, how does it matter whether the initial population sizes of those two species are vastly different? If the population size of hypothetically speaking, if the population size of species B, which is a poorer competitor, is 100 times the population size of species A, which is the superior competitor, will competitive exclusion actually take place? Very often, the law of competitive exclusion is sort of circular in that if you see two species that are very, very similar and they are allopatric, they don't occupy the same range, then that's interpreted as evidence for competitive exclusion and that this law works. But if you see two species that are very, very similar, that are sympatric and have been sympatric since we know the distributions of these species, then often the interpretation is there's something that we have not measured about these two species. They differ in some important way that allow them to keep competition minimum and allow them to coexist. So something to think about whether the law of competitive exclusion actually is universal and does it actually occur in nature. So again, going back to sort of concepts of the ghost of competition past, what is the evidence that competition actually happens? Very often in many of the systems that we are studying, we can't actually go in and change the number of individuals that are there of one species and see what effect that will have on the population size or the population growth rate of a different species. Some of the evidence comes from instances like islands, where on the mainland you might have two species, both of which are competing with each other, and on the island one of those species is missing. And when one of those competitor species is not present, it's missing on the island, then the density of the other competitor species is much higher than its density on the mainland where its competitor is present. This is called density inflation, where the abundance of one species increases when its competitor species is not present. There's also ecological release. Again, where you have two species competing with each other on for example, a mainland, then the niche breadths of both of those species are smaller than the niche breadth of a species on the island where the competitor is absent. So these two populations of these two species on the mainland might be eating slightly different things to try and reduce to minimize competition, whereas on the island the species that is present is actually eating both of the kinds of resources that species A is eating separately and species B is eating separately on the mainland. And so this is called ecological release, where when the competitor is absent, the niche of the other species expands, niche breadth increases. There's also something called character displacement, which is if you have two species and those two species are likely to be competitors, and let's say those two species are found in allopatry, whereas there is a range of one species and a range of another species, and those two parts of the range don't overlap with each other, and there is a part of the range of both those species where these two species do overlap in their geographical ranges, for example, then species 1 and species 2 will be much more similar in trait value. Let's say beak length. Beak length is an important determinant for birds in terms of what they can and cannot eat. And if you looked at beak length for two bird species that are potential competitors, when they are found separately, beak length is likely to be more similar than when they are found together. Where they are found together, the requirement for niche differentiation drives over evolutionary time that beak length to become different between species 1 and species 2, so that competition between them is minimized, and they're specializing now on a different resource, on different resources. Whereas where they're found separately and there's no competitor, actually the beak length goes to a more optimal length to be able to exploit whatever resources that these species are using more efficiently. So that was competition, which is a lateral interaction between two species at the same trophic level, both of whom have mutually negative impacts on each other. Next time we will talk about predation as a force in structuring communities. Thank you very much for joining, and see you next time.